Hello and welcome to the CEBRA webinar. My name is Dominic Smith and I am one of the organizers of the webinar series on behalf of the Central Bank Research Association. Raphael Schunle is the other co-organizer, and without much ado, let me pass on the virtual stage to Hugh Montag, research economist at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who will be today's moderator.
Hello. The topics of today's sessions are which macroeconomic news matters for price setting and the granular origins of inflation. I'd like to give a special thanks to the organizers, Raphael Schunle from Brandeis University and Dominic Smith from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. This webinar will be 45 minutes in total and will contain two presentations of about 15 minutes each, and at the end there will be 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio and video, but are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. Attendees can post their questions during the presentations already, and they do not have to wait until the end of the presentations. I will then select questions to be answered in the Q&A portion of the webinar after the presentations have concluded. This webinar is also live streamed via the CEBRA YouTube channel and is recorded and will be made available on the CEBRA website at www.cebra.org and the CEBRA YouTube channel after the event. Finally, a disclaimer. Participation in a CEBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of the views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a CEBRA or CEBRA-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of CEBRA, the co-sponsoring institutions, or any other participating institutions. Okay, finally. First, Lukas will present, who is a postdoctoral researcher at ETH Zurich and the University of Mannheim, will present which macroeconomic news matters for price setting. Lukas, I turn it over to you.
All right, so thanks a lot. I'll start sharing my screen. Give me a second. All right, so I assume you can all see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Okay, very good. Well, then thanks to everyone for tuning in, and thanks to the organizers, of course, for inviting me to present. This is joint work with Davut Rostamashar from Mannheim, and the paper asks, as you just said, which macroeconomic news matter for price setting. This research question is motivated by the large increase in price adjustment frequencies that we have seen during the post-COVID inflation surge. So, for example, this increase in adjustment frequencies can be seen in our own survey, the German Business Panel. So between mid-2022 and 23, we fielded two questions asking firms first, at which frequency have you historically adjusted your prices for your main product? And that's what we show here on the horizontal axis of the bin scatter. But then we've also asked as a second question, at which frequency do you currently adjust your prices? And that's given on the vertical axis. Now, currently versus historically was not further specified in the survey, but it was fielded in the middle of the inflation surge. Okay? Now, since most markers line up below the 45-degree line, we can conclude that price durations have decreased, or put differently, that price adjustment frequencies have increased. And on the right, we show the very same data, just in a more aggregated form, where we can see that more than 50% of firms report a decrease in the price durations. Now, similar patterns have been documented elsewhere for different countries, typically for more specific industries. Because of this motivating evidence, we ask what drivers are behind these extensive margin choices of firms during and after the post-COVID inflation surge. That is, we ask which macro news matter for extensive margin price setting. So our focus is really on macroeconomic data releases and how extensive margin price plans respond to these releases. Now, what is our approach? So key to our approach is that we have been running a survey among German firms. And the nice feature of our survey is that on each day, we send out invitations to a random subset of firms to participate in our survey. Now, the idea here is that we can compare the price plans of these firms in a tight window around macroeconomic data releases. So first, the daily bit here gives you hope that you actually observe firms around this tight window. And the randomization bit gives you hope that the firms answering before and after are actually comparable and we do not just pick up compositional changes. So from this, you already get that I cannot interview the same firm every day, of course, that's infeasible. So I need to work on the repeated cross-section, and that's where the randomization becomes handy. Now, what do we find? We find data releases about prices, the CPI, and employment move price plans significantly, whereas other commonly studied types of news, for example, from industrial production releases, do not significantly affect the extensive margin sales price plans of firms. Now, that finding can be partly explained by studying news coverage from newspapers and news searches according to Google Trends. Now, let me skip the contribution in the interest of time and directly jump to the data. So our data is from the so-called German business panel. My co-author is the leading PI who runs this survey. It was launched in 2020. It has a low frequency panel dimension, hence the name, but we will really use the data as a repeated cross-section. Now, the survey targets decision makers in firms, and more than 90% of the respondents report to be in the executive body of the firm. Since mid-2021, we have the following question on the extensive margin sales price plan. The question reads, what decision are you planning in the next year? Increase sales prices, we code it as a +1. No change, a 0, or a decrease in sales prices, we code it as a -1. So you see that we also incorporate the sign of the change, although empirically, most firms answer either price increase or no change, so that the treatment of price decreases is not really crucial for the results. Now, given this answer, I can go ahead and compute the average price plan in the cross-section of firms on each daily date T. Importantly, T refers to the date on which we received a reply from a respondent. And the current sample runs until last summer, essentially. All right, let's have a look at data. So here I show you this data as blue solid line. It's here actually given by a 4-week backward-looking moving average of the daily sales price plan to smooth out some of the daily variation. For comparison, I also show you CPI inflation as this dashed red line where I put the same constant value within a month, right? So CPI is only monthly. Now we can see that both variables seem strongly correlated, and one may interpret this as a validation that the daily data, captures something sensible. And if one looks carefully enough, one can actually see that our price variable leads the CPI inflation. And that makes a lot of sense since we measure plans about future price changes. All right. But before moving on, let's take a step back and ask, why is it okay to treat the data as a repeated cross-section? And as I said in the introduction, our argument is it's okay because on each workday, we send out invitations to a random subset of firms to participate in the survey. Now, daily invitations give us that we get approximately the same number of responses on each weekday in general, but also on each day around data releases in particular. That's what you can see here in the chart on the left. And that's just for all data releases pooled, which happen at 0. On average, we have 29 firms answering on a day. That's low, of course. And this is sort of the cost of running a daily survey. But we can still pool over a couple of days before and after a data release to get to reasonable response numbers. Now, given these stable response numbers, the randomization here helps us to also get a stable characteristic distribution of firms around data releases. And we see that here on the right, there's really nothing visible at the event, which still takes place at the 0 date. And we can do more. We can look at additional balancing tests, focusing, for example, on respondent characteristics. Here, the idea is that, for example, a paper by Levchenko and co-authors shows that it matters for inflation expectations sometimes which person within a firm answers a survey. Okay? And finally, on the right, we can look at response timing relative to the invitation date. So here, the idea is that response timing can be indicative of unobservable heterogeneity. So maybe firms under stress have different priorities and respond later. So what I'm showing here, for example, the black area is firms that answer within a week after being invited, or the dark gray area here, firms that answer in the second week after being invited, and so on. Again, I think along both these dimensions, this looks very well, and that's our main argument why we think it's reasonable to treat the data as a repeated cross-section here. Let's move on to our main econometric framework. So that's our main specification. The left-hand side is the average price plan of firms computed over 1 to H days after a data release, minus the average price plan of firms on the H days before a data release. We project that on the forecast error for release n, which is given by the realization of n, xn, minus a consensus professional forecast from Bloomberg. Now, this forecast error really measures the news content of a given release n. Now, what is n? We focus on 6 types of data releases, including CPI inflation, unemployment rate releases, industrial production, the monthly trade balance, manufacturing orders, and number 6 is the IFO index, a well-known firm sentiment indicator for the German economy. Additionally, we control for the previous release value of n from the last month and 28 daily lags of the price plan. And finally, we standardize the left-hand side variable and the forecast error just to ease interpretation. Okay, let's have a look at the results. So here I show you the main results for the pricing plans. Each column shows a data release under consideration, so corresponds to regressions with a given forecast error. The colors or markers indicate the window length. That is whether we compare averages over 2, 5, or 10 days before and after the release. So this is just about the left-hand side. Now, what we can see. Let's focus on CPI first. We can see that a positive CPI surprise, so inflation being higher than expected, leads to a significant upward revision in pricing plans, regardless of the window length. The magnitudes, they're quantitatively meaningful, so a standard deviation surprise leads to price plan revisions in the ballpark of half a standard deviation. Now, the effects increase in the window length, consistent with frictions, let's say in information processing, planning, etc. Next, moving to employment, for a standard deviation employment surprise, that is, for example, a surprise decrease in the unemployment rate, we find a similar upward revision in price plans, although these effects are only visible with a somewhat longer window length. The last variable for which we detect significant effects is a surprise increase in the monthly trade deficit here. Okay? But the effects are much smaller in magnitudes. They are fine, but that's why we don't emphasize it in the introduction too much. Now, in contrast, for industrial production, manufacturing orders, and the IFO index, we find nothing that is statistically significant. So the bottom line here is that news about prices and employment stand out as potential macroeconomic drivers behind extensive margin price plans. Next, we can investigate the dynamics by estimating daily local projections, for which we just modify the left-hand side here of the regression from before. So we estimate cumulative local projections. I want you to focus only on the blue lines, maybe just on the first 2 panels here for inflation and employment, where we can see that these effects that I've documented in the event study are quite persistent. Now, as one additional step to better understand these results, we compile additional daily data on news searches and news coverage. So for each type of data release n, we construct an additional daily time series of news coverage and an additional daily time series of news searches. News coverage is simply the daily count of articles that mention a keyword in the headline that is associated with a data release under consideration, or in simple words, for example, we count the number of articles that mention inflation in the headline. For news searches, we use the corresponding daily Google search intensities with the same keyword. So for example, Google searches for inflation. Below, I quickly show you the series only for the news coverage and news searches for inflation, and you see they display the same inverse U shape as realized inflation. Now, let me start with news coverage and run the same type of event study regressions where I put the revision or the change in news coverage around data releases on the left-hand side. I project that on an indicator being activated when news N is released. What do we find? We find a significant increase in news coverage for employment and inflation, which again quantitatively stand out. That's consistent with the main results that we had for price plans. But we also, in fact, detect a significant increase for all other data releases too. So it seems that we can rule out that some releases have no effect on prices simply because nobody is reporting on them. Let's look at news searches. So here again, similar specification. Again, we find large effects for inflation and employment, consistent with price plans. More generally, we find a pattern that looks remarkably similar as for news coverage. So consistent with news searches and coverage being jointly determined. And finally, I want to transparently say that the only thing that's slightly more challenging to reconcile with our price plan estimates is this IFO index response here. So we find no effect of the IFO on price plans, but a strong news coverage and news search response. But it could simply be that it's not so clear what an IFO index surprise implies for the optimal price adjustment. Perhaps it's just mixing supply and demand disturbances. In my last minute, I want to talk about the last result. In particular, I want to show you a comparison with a very nice paper by Ivan Yotsov, Nick Bloom, and co-authors. So they argue that the change in the CPI inflation and not the surprise component matters for price setting of UK firms. And the reason is that the media is primarily reporting about the change in inflation. That might be a problem because our regressor is not the change, but the surprise component. However, we can reconcile with their media story by showing that news coverage responds considerably stronger when the underlying CPI surprise is large. And this differential effect is quite sizable here. It exceeds one standard deviation. And even more, we also find that news searches respond considerably stronger to CPI events with large surprises, suggesting that this information somehow arrives at agents. Okay? So we have additional results and robustness and so on in the paper, but I'm out of time, so we'll just conclude. This paper asks which macroeconomic news matter for price setting, and the bottom line is that news about inflation and employment do matter. Other types of news matter less. That's it. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Andrei Levchenko, who's a professor of international economics at the University of Michigan, and he will be presenting the granular origins of.
Thank you very much for having me. This is joint work with Santiago Alvarez Blazer, who is at the Bank of Spain, Sarah Line, and Rafael Auer. And Rafael is at the BIS, and so the standard disclaimer applies. So the literature on monetary economics and inflation has this feature that inflation is fundamentally driven by aggregate factors, like aggregate productivity shocks or monetary policy shocks or some other kind of demand shocks. This is a view that's probably most famously encapsulated by the quote by Milton Friedman, who said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And of course, the more modern literature has modeled and shown empirically vast amounts of heterogeneity across firms in how they set prices and how they respond to shocks. But typically in this literature, the heterogeneity at the end is just integrated out, and all that's left is the impacts of the aggregate shocks on inflation and output. However, in a different part of the macro literature, people have observed that the distribution of firm sizes are so skewed that firm-level idiosyncratic shocks can actually move aggregates like GDP. So this is the literature that was started by the seminal paper by Xavier Gabex called Granular Origins of Aggregate Fluctuations. And this view since his paper has been confirmed in various empirical studies, including some of the work that I've done earlier. And we now understand, or at least believe, that the large firms actually contribute to aggregate fluctuations. So shocks to the biggest firms in the economy, think about Apple or Nokia and so on, can actually move aggregate GDP. And so partly aggregate GDP is driven by idiosyncratic shocks to these large firms. However, no one has explored the potential contributions of individual large firms to inflation. All of the granularity literature has focused on real outcomes like GDP or aggregate output. And what we're going to do in this paper is to look at whether granularities are present in inflation as well as output. So for that, we're going to use multi-country home scan data set, like a barcode level data set for 16 countries that records the barcode level prices, but it also has information on product category. As usual, the firm, this is something is going to take some work to get, but we're going to have information on the firm that's producing each individual barcode, and in many cases also retailer. So think about Carrefour or Aldi or something like that. With these data, we're going to look at whether inflation is granular by developing a decomposition of aggregate inflation into multiple granular residuals, so terms that highlight the contribution of individual firms or categories or retailers to aggregate inflation. So this is going to be an extension of the typical granular residual object that appears in this literature. And what we're going to find is that inflation, this is a kind of grocery store inflation. That should be an obvious disclaimer. So this is what you typically get in this home scan type of data sets. But in this setting, inflation is actually mostly granular. It's 60% granular for advanced countries, so countries that have low baseline inflation levels. Of this 60%, 40 percentage points of the 60 percentage points is actually due to the idiosyncratic shocks to large firms, and the remaining 20% is due to the idiosyncratic shocks to individual product categories. And just if we focus at top 10 firms, not 1%, but just 10 firms, that is going to be responsible for 25% of the variance of inflation. So indeed, as has been found in other settings, the economy is highly granular, and large firms carry a tremendous amount of weight. Our granular residuals are going to combine both the truly idiosyncratic shocks to firms and also the differential response of larger firms to common shocks. And we're going to find that, at least in the baseline sample, mostly the firm granular residual is due to the truly idiosyncratic shocks to firms as opposed to stronger responses to common shocks. And we're also going to find that this granularity is more important in more concentrated markets, which is, in a sense, a direct consequence of the fact that granularity in the first place comes from concentration of market shares among a small set of firms. We're also going to do several additional exercises to enrich these results a little bit. First, we're going to add the retailer dimension, which we can only do for a more limited sample because we don't always have the retailer. But for that sample, it will turn out that retailers also contribute to granular inflation. Their contribution is about half of the magnitude of the firm granular residual. So firms, again, think about like Unilever or Nestle. are more important for granular fluctuations than retailers like Carrefour or Aldi or Lidl. Then we're going to show that granularity is contributed to the post 2020 inflation spike. We have data up until 2022, and over this period, if anything, the importance of the granular residual increased relative to the pre-2020 period. So the inflation surge was to an important extent a granular phenomenon, meaning larger firms increased prices by more than smaller firms. And as a final exercise, we are going to look at the impact of these granularities on the transmission of monetary policy shocks. And we're going to find that granularities slow down the monetary policy transmission, and they're largely responsible for the famous price puzzle, whereby inflation initially increases due to a monetary contraction. We find that essentially the large majority of the price puzzle is due to the movements in these granular residuals. All right, so our data set is going to come from AMARC home scan. It's a home scan data set, right? So households that participate are scanning the items that they purchased in the supermarkets and drugstores, and then that goes into the database. We're going to have 16 countries that cover both advanced economies and emerging markets. So we're going to have, US, Germany, et cetera, but we're also going to have Russia, Argentina, Hungary. For most countries, we're going to have data from 2008 to 2022. In rare cases, the data are going to extend back to 2005. And unfortunately, for Russia and US, the data ends in 2020 with currently no possibility of an update to 2022. So with this database, we're going to compute an object, which is in blue, the change in price for barcode I in product category G by firm F in country C at time T, which is a year-on-year price change in that barcode, where obviously we have many instances of that. So we take the median as usual within that cell, and we'll compute a year-on-year change at the quarterly frequency. So this is kind of the core data set that we're gonna have. It is going to end up with 50 million observations. And then for us, aggregate inflation is going to be this object in blue in the second bullet point, which is essentially the barcode level price change weighted by the expenditure share on that barcode in aggregate expenditure in that country. That's the W. And that's going to be our inflation in country C at time T. So these market shares, these W's are very concentrated. This is the kernel densities of the log market shares across our sample of countries. The dark dashed line is the US, and then all the other lines are in gray. And for the US, for example, 10 largest firms are responsible for 31% of expenditures in this data set. And in Germany, it's even more, it's like 44%. When you go to top 1% of firms, so obviously that's more than 10 firms, the average market share, combined market share of top 1% of firms is 78%. So the sales are extremely concentrated among a small set of firms, which opens the door to potentially these firms having idiosyncratic impacts on inflation. Okay, so let me go over the kind of textbook granular residual very quickly. So in the first line is the inflation from the previous slide, and then I can write it without loss of any generality as sum of two terms. One is the unweighted average price change across all the barcodes in this economy, just a simple average, so 1 over n is the number of barcodes. and the granular residual, which is a deviation of the price of barcode I from this unweighted average, weighted by the share of that barcode in the aggregate expenditure. Right. So just to put an interpretation of what these things are, let's kind of specialize it and have a model in quotation marks for the price change. Suppose that the price change is a sum of two components: a true aggregate shock in the economy, I'm going to call that delta CT, just indexed by country, and an idiosyncratic shock to that barcode that is orthogonal to other shocks or to the country shock, right? If you plug in this quote unquote model for a price change into the formula from before, you get that the aggregate component, the macro component, the script M, is just the aggregate shock, right? That's, you can think of that as like monetary policy shock or productivity shock. And then the granular residual is essentially the idiosyncratic shock weighted by the share of the firm of the barcode in the aggregate expenditure, right? And
there are 4 minutes left in the presentation.
4 minutes left. Okay. So if we do that, then we get this for Germany, that the granular residual is actually important. So these idiosyncratic deviations of the barcodes from the unweighted average price change across the economy is a significant component of inflation. But up here, we of course don't know whether these barcode deviations have like a common firm component or a common product component or a common retailer component. And so when we go to our core exercise, we are going to enrich this model, right? So now the model for a price is going to have still the country component. Then it's going to have a firm component, which is a true idiosyncratic shock delta, plus a differential sensitivity of firm F to some aggregate shock eta. And then same for the product. So two truly idiosyncratic shock to the product category, plus a differential sensitivity to aggregate shocks. And then we're going to reach a decomposition of the aggregate inflation into still the aggregate component, the granular residual that has to do with the idiosyncratic deviations of individual firms from aggregate shocks, and then the product granular residual, which is the idiosyncratic deviations of the product category from other product category. So when we do that, both the firm and the product category seem to be quantitatively important, and this is essentially the main result. So when we decompose inflation, delta PCT, 44% of the variance of inflation can be accounted for by the truly aggregate shock M, 41% by the firm component for firm granular residual, and then 15% by the product granular residual. It turns out that just taking the top 10 firms is going to give you 26% of the variability in aggregate inflation is just driven by the top 10 firms, not 10%, top 10. So that's essentially the main result. Since I am out of time, let me move on to probably the most interesting part, which is the contribution of the granularities to monetary policy transmission. So here we run a monetary policy impulse response, where we take each component, which is the aggregate granular residual for the firm and product, is estimate the impact of monetary policy shocks on that, and then aggregate up to the total inflation, and that is what we get. So the black line here is the response of inflation to a monetary contraction. Here you see a price puzzle as usual, right? Following a monetary contraction, inflation initially increases. On the right are the granular residual impulse responses, and you see essentially the price puzzle appears in the granular residuals. So both the firm and the category granular residuals increase following a monetary contraction, and that timing coincides with the peak of the price puzzle in the total actual inflation, right? And so 75% of the price puzzle at the peak is actually accounted for by the mysterious behavior of the granular residuals, whereas the macro component, the price puzzle, is much more muted. Okay, so that's what I have. We found that inflation is substantially granular, and within the different granularities, what matters is the granularity across firms, and just the top 10 firms are responsible for 25% of the variance of inflation in our data. And this granularity has an impact on the transmission of monetary policy. Essentially, the price puzzle is mostly accounted for by the behavior of the granular residuals. So I'll stop here.
Okay, great. We now have time for a short Q&A. So I'll start fielding questions. The first question is for Lukas. Someone asks, some of the New Zealand work by Yuri Levchenko and others find that firms react strongly to information that is relevant to firms, but less to aggregate information. I think this kind of fits with your results. Might that matter for finding insignificant results for some of your forecast errors, such as trade deficit forecasts that only matter for firms that engage in imports exports?
All right, yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are a couple of things to consider. The first is we have to be a little bit careful with what studies we can compare. I guess we all suspect that there can be some state dependence in terms of the sensitivity of firms to macro news. I think a lot of the work by Yuri Levchenko and co-authors was before the post-COVID inflation surge. There could be one channel why it's more difficult to explain. In general, I'm very sympathetic that this could be a reason why, there's treatment effect heterogeneity. The trade balance news, for example, just matter for a small subset of firms. So in the aggregate, we do not pick something up. I will nevertheless want to say one thing, that I think the aggregate beyond the local conditions is important. So for example, you could ask why firms should care about inflation, but there are many possible channels. So first, firms, they should care about real profits. So inflation matters. Inflation can be informative about future costs, think about wage bargaining, etc. It can also be informative potentially about future demand, if thinking about nominal income and so on. Similar for employment, you could make, well, maybe local employment matters, but then employment more generally can matter too, again, because high employment means higher labor market tightness, higher wages, higher aggregate demand. So also there you can make the case that aggregates should matter to some extent, and that is at least consistent with this strong correlation that we have in the data between price adjustment frequencies and inflation. And there must be something that can explain this. And we are trying to get there a little bit closer. Well, great question.
Okay, next is a question for Professor Levchenko. How can I interpret the result that the price puzzle comes from granular firms? If I think the price puzzle is due to info effects, then it could be that granular firms closely monitor the Federal Reserve to also learn about how they view the state of the economy and to learn the policy role, or is there another explanation?
No, that's a great question. I mean, at this point, we can only speculate. I think it's consistent with some of the work that's been done by Mike Wow and Simon Monhay, that shows that monetary contraction increases the cost of capital, but disproportionately for smaller firms, and so larger firms can actually raise markups. But we don't know, and I don't know if we can. We haven't thought yet a ton about how we can use our data to probe deeper into this. Yeah.
Okay. Next is a question for Lukas. It's kind of a two-parter. Are the pricing reactions symmetric to negative and positive surprises? And then I guess I'd like to add on what happens if you only look at the frequency of price decreases or price increases. I have a paper where we found that price decreases stayed flat or kind of went up a bit during the recent inflation, which kind of would disappear in the regression that you run right now.
Yeah, so both very good questions. So we were looking at asymmetries at some point, but we find like no significant asymmetries, and part of that is really the statistical power we had. So imagine our sample right now contains about 36 releases, so 36 months. If you split that then into two buckets again, there's not so much left that makes it tricky. But in principle, I could imagine a lot of worlds or theories where you should have some of these asymmetries. So it's very natural to investigate that. The other thing on the treatment of decreases versus increases. So in our data, it is a fact that hardly any firm reports a decrease. Of course, that's also in this more specific sample is a part of the reason. And therefore, I can either look just at the absolute change, so whether there is a change, or I can look at what I did, where an increase counts as a +1, a decrease as a -1, but the results will look very similar just because there are so few decreases. Yeah.
Okay. Next is a question for Professor Levchenko. Does your paper, kind of a personal question, does your paper have any implications for how the government should be sampling firms for inclusion in official statistics? For example, maybe sample size isn't as important as having the large firms in the sample.
No, that's a great question. I don't know if we thought a ton about it, in the sense that, in our data set we observe all the firms, and so we haven't taken the next step to think about, if we didn't observe all the firms, what would happen. I mean, my feeling is that if you drop statistician into the sample and just have them sample completely randomly, the granularity will be recovered because it's just going to be a smaller sample, but the larger firms are going to be much more likely to increase. So I don't know if this has an obvious implication for errors in official statistics or not. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Next is a question for Lukas. Are you able to tell whether firms raise prices in response to a high CPI because they are learning something about their likely costs of inputs, or whether they're learning something about the behavior of the competitors? Maybe if you did a comparison across industries or something similar, you could recover that.
Yeah, that's a great question after treatment effect heterogeneity, what is underlying that. So far, we cannot say that much. And the reason is really the sample size. So we did a little bit of splits, but we have to be careful. If you remember, we have like 30 firms answering on a given day. Then I pool over, let's say, 5 days. So I'm having 150 firms. I can do some splits, but not too much. That's why we did some splits where we just split them into two buckets, basically, by the median of something. But we haven't thought in this dimension whether there's like a clear industry where we can convincingly argue that one channel should be more important than the other, but we should rethink that. So we haven't thought too much about it. I think it's a very interesting suggestion to dig deeper there.
Okay. I think we might have time for one more question for Professor Levchenko. How should we think about strategic complementarities and granularities?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have a little bit of that in the paper. So it seems like it would manifest itself in the correlated responses to common shocks by larger firms, right? So we had this component of the granular residual, which was differential sensitivity to common shocks, and so it seems like it would show up as higher lambdas, the higher sensitivities for larger firms, and we have a derivation in the appendix that kind of shows that. So that's a bit of an ambiguity, because in a sense, if the second biggest food products firm is responding endogenously to a true idiosyncratic shock to Nestle, it's still an idiosyncratic shock. It's not an aggregate shock, but it's just a more spread out response to an idiosyncratic shock. And so we have versions in the paper where we very the number of these common factors that we put in, and as you put more and more common factors, it absorbs more and more of these complementarities. But there's also not super sensitive to how many factors you put.
Okay. It's 11:45, so I think we've reached the end of the seminar. I would like to thank both speakers for presenting their research today, and I'd also like to thank everyone who attended and asked questions. Have a pleasant rest of your Thursday.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.